They had chrome that gleamed like mirrors, engines that roared instead of whispered, and dashboards that looked like airplane cockpits. Cars of the 1970s weren't just machines. They were personalities, each one with a heartbeat made of steel and gasoline. You could tell who someone was by what they drove. A Mustang meant spirit. A Cadillac meant pride. A Volkswagen Beetle meant you didn't care what anyone thought. Every curve, every color, every roar said something about freedom. It was a time when the American road still felt untamed. There were no backup cameras, no airbags, no beeping reminders to fasten your seatbelt. When you turned the key, you weren't just starting a car. You were starting a conversation between man, machine, and the open road. You could feel every vibration through the steering wheel, smell the faint sweetness of fuel in the air, and hear the deep hum that echoed through the body panels. The car didn't protect you from the world. It let you feel it. Back then, design came from instinct, not algorithms. Car makers weren't worried about fuel efficiency or crash data. They were chasing a feeling. Long hoods stretched into the distance. Doors shut with a metallic thud that meant something. Interiors were wrapped in real metal and thick vinyl, not soft plastic. Even the keys felt heavy, like a promise that what you held was built to last. There was pride in craftsmanship, and risk was part of the reward. And maybe that's what people loved most about the danger. Driving was never supposed to be perfectly safe. It was supposed to feel alive. The 1970s driver didn't think much about safety ratings. They thought about horsepower, about how the car looked when it caught the light, about how it sounded when you hit the gas at midnight. For them, the road was an escape from rules, not a reminder of them. But under the beauty, there was chaos waiting. Those gleaming chrome edges could slice, those steering wheels could crush, and that intoxicating smell of gasoline carried a quiet poison. Few realized it then, but freedom was about to meet its limits. The age of pure expression on four wheels was running out of road. Because as America moved forward, the same qualities that made these cars thrilling would soon make them targets of new laws. Safety, emissions, and efficiency were about to rewrite everything from the sound of the engine to the shape of the hood ornament. The cars of the 1970s still live on in memory, in classic car shows and drive-ins, in the way people talk about how cars used to feel. They remind us that once, driving was more than getting somewhere, it was being somewhere. But as the open roads of the 70s turned into the regulated highways of the 80s, freedom came face to face with safety. There were no backup cameras, no airbags, and barely any rules. The 1970s car world was the Wild West where imagination had no limits, and every manufacturer wanted to build something louder, faster, and bolder than the last. Engineers could dream without restraint, and drivers could take those dreams straight to the streets. Every year brought something outrageous. Longer hoods, sharper lines, louder engines, brighter paint. It was as if every car was trying to shout, "Look at me." The roads were full of personality back then. Muscle cars prowled like Predator's Camaro, GTO, Challenger, Charger. Convertibles floated through summer air, their engines rumbling like thunder rolling through small towns. Custom mods were everywhere. Hood scoops, chrome pipes, flames painted on the sides. There were no limits, no official rulebook telling designers what not to do. If a company thought it looked cool or felt powerful, they built it. The 1970s were the last great experiment in pure automotive freedom. There was little government oversight before 1975. Car safety was still treated as a personal choice, not a manufacturer's duty. The only safety features were what you could afford or what you decided to install yourself. Seatbelts were optional in many models. Dashboard padding was more of an idea than a standard. It was a time when horsepower mattered more than protection, and a sleek design could sell better than any crash rating. The laws simply hadn't caught up to the passion yet. People didn't think of these cars as dangerous. They thought of them as powerful. The lack of emission standards meant engines could breathe freely, creating that signature deep growl when the key turned. Exhaust fumes filled the air at drive-ins and gas stations, and no one seemed to mind. The smell of gasoline was just part of the experience, as familiar as the leather seats or the crackle of an AM radio. Every sound, every vibration, every turn of the wheel was raw and unfiltered. It was a playground for innovation and rebellion. Designers treated cars like art pieces. One company experimented with futuristic bubble roofs, another with enormous tail fins that looked like rocket ships. Drivers customized everything: the wheels, the spoilers, even the steering knobs. It wasn't about following standards. It was about standing out. The car was an extension of personality, an act of expression, and sometimes a declaration of defiance. But that freedom came with a cost. Behind all that excitement, accidents were climbing. Emissions from millions of cars darkened city skies. Engines that roared with pride also burned leaded fuel that poisoned the air. Slowly, awareness began to grow that the same cars that symbolized independence were also creating chaos on the roads and in the atmosphere. The era of unchecked creativity was thrilling while it lasted. It gave the world some of the most unforgettable designs in automotive history, but it couldn't last forever. The speed, the smoke, the wild beauty of those machines had pushed too far. And soon, the dreams got too wild and lawmakers began to slam the brakes. Once upon a time, fill her up meant pumping lead straight into your engine and into the air you breathed. At every gas station in America, chrome nozzles hissed and clanked as gallons of leaded gasoline flowed into tanks. It was the sound of power, the scent of the open road, and for a long time, no one questioned it. The blue and red gas pumps were icons of freedom, lined up under bright neon lights, serving drivers who just wanted a smoother ride and a little more kick under the hood. Leaded gasoline had been around since the 1920s, but it truly defined the cars of the 1970s. Drivers loved it because it made engines run quietly and boosted performance. Mechanics swore by it. It stopped engine knock, added horsepower, and made every start feel effortless. To most people, it wasn't just normal, it was better. The label Ethel on a pump meant quality. Parents filled up the family station wagon with it. Teenagers poured it into their first beat-up Chevys, and no one thought twice. But science was catching up to the smell of freedom. Behind the smooth performance and shiny tailpipes, something sinister was building. Studies began showing that the same chemical giving engines their punch was seeping into the air, the soil, and the bloodstream of millions. Lead poisoning wasn't just a risk for factory workers. It was affecting children, families, and entire neighborhoods. The invisible cost of performance was becoming impossible to ignore. The Environmental Protection Agency, newly formed in the early 1970s, took notice. What followed was one of the biggest cultural and industrial shifts in automotive history. Under the Clean Air Act, leaded gasoline was targeted for phase-out. Manufacturers resisted at first, arguing it would ruin performance, hurt sales, and make engines unreliable. But the tide was turning. Public health became part of the conversation, and car culture was forced to evolve. By the late 1970s, unleaded fuel pumps began to appear alongside the old ones. For the first time, drivers had a choice: the familiar leaded gas they trusted, or the cleaner, slightly weaker alternative that represented a new future. Mechanics retooled engines, fuel companies reformulated products, and slowly, the smell of progress began to change. By the mid-1980s, leaded gas was nearly gone from American stations, a quiet revolution that cleaned the skies and redefined what it meant to drive responsibly. The ban wasn't just about health or science. It symbolized a changing attitude. The same nation that once prized power above all else was beginning to prioritize protection of people, of the environment, of the generations yet to come. Cars would never sound quite the same again, but maybe that was the point. In the end, "fill up" stopped meaning danger disguised as power. It became a small reminder that progress often means letting go of what once felt right. But it wasn't just the fuel that got outlawed. Some of the flashiest car parts did too. From razor-sharp hood ornaments to metal dashboards, cars once looked deadly beautiful, and sometimes they were literally deadly. The 1970s were full of chrome dreams. Long gleaming hoods, polished grills, and dashboards that shined like mirrors under the afternoon sun. Every part of the car looked like a work of art, sculpted for style rather than survival. A hood ornament wasn't just decoration, it was a statement of pride, a tiny piece of sculpture leading the way through the wind. But beauty came with a hidden cost. In a crash, that elegance could turn lethal. Those same ornaments that glittered in the sunlight became blades in motion. The famous leaping Jaguar, the Cadillac Goddess, even the simple metal spears of an Oldsmobile could pierce flesh in a collision. No one thought of it then. It was all about class and character. But as car accidents rose and safety studies expanded, these icons of prestige started to look like weapons. Inside, things weren't much safer. Cars of the 1970s often featured hard metal dashboards, thick steering columns, and steering wheels with thin spokes and no cushioning. A sudden stop could send a driver's head or chest into solid steel. There were no airbags, no collapsible steering systems, no padded edges. A crash wasn't just dangerous, it was unforgiving. Yet people loved to look. That cold shine, that heavy feel gave cars a sense of toughness, of permanence, as if the vehicle was as unbreakable as the driver wanted to feel. What the eye saw as luxury, engineers soon began to see as risk. By the mid-1970s, the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, FMVSS, started changing everything. Manufacturers were required to redesign dashboards, steering columns, and front ends to reduce injury during crashes. Crumple zones became the new design language, absorbing impact instead of reflecting it. Interiors grew softer, lined with foam and plastic. Chrome faded, sharp lines rounded off. The age of gleam was ending, replaced by the age of caution. For many, the change felt like losing something. Those bold, heavy designs had given cars a face, a sense of identity. The shift to safety meant uniformly sleeker, duller shapes that followed the law, not the heart. The shimmering metal that once caught the sun now hid behind layers of plastic. You could still drive fast, but you couldn't feel the same danger in your hands. It was as if the cars themselves had been tamed, stripped of the wildness that once defined them. Still, no one could deny the results. Injuries dropped. Deaths declined. The road slowly became a safer place. What vanished in style returned in peace of mind. The chrome ornaments ended up in museums and collectors' garages, beautiful relics from a time when design came before restraint. The shine of the 1970s dimmed not because people stopped caring about beauty, but because they began to understand its cost. The reflections on the hood had once shown who we were: bold, fearless, a little reckless. But while car interiors softened, drivers still wanted danger from under the hood. Engines that could rattle windows, shake driveways, and hit 60 before you could finish a sentence until the law caught up. The 1970s began in a roar. The American muscle car was at its peak, a symbol of unfiltered power and attitude. On every street, you could hear the thunder of a V8 before you saw it. The Dodge Charger, Pontiac GTO, and Camaro Z28 weren't just cars. They were statements. They announced their presence in a heartbeat, every rev a declaration of freedom. It wasn't about practicality. It was about pride, dominance, and the pure joy of acceleration. These machines were built for adrenaline. No speed governors, no emission restrictions, no quiet mufflers, just raw force. When you pressed the pedal, the world blurred, and the sound became part of you. Teenagers customized exhausts to make them louder. Car magazines compared quarter-mile times like battle scores. The street wasn't just a place to drive, it was an arena. And for a brief, glorious moment, it felt like power had no limits. But then, the rules began to change. The same government that had tamed leaded gas and outlawed sharp chrome now turned its gaze toward what was under the hood. The Environmental Protection Agency introduced stricter emission standards in 1975. Car companies were forced to install catalytic converters devices that filtered exhaust but strangled performance. Engines that once roared began to hum. Horsepower dropped. Suddenly, the same cars that once pushed 400 horsepower were lucky to manage half of that. At the same time, the world faced an energy crisis. Gas prices spiked, and fuel economy became a national obsession. Muscle cars, once symbols of American might, were now seen as gas-guzzling relics. Insurance companies raised premiums on high-performance vehicles, making them unaffordable for the average driver. Slowly, the beast disappeared from showrooms. The proud chrome badges and racing stripes gave way to quieter, smaller, more efficient models that didn't rattle the neighborhood. To car enthusiasts, it felt like the soul of driving was being silenced. The growl of a carbureted engine gave way to the hum of efficiency. The rebellion that once defined the road had been replaced with responsibility. For the first time, performance took a back seat to pollution control and regulation. It wasn't the end of cars, but it was the end of an era. Still, the legends lived on. The sight of a vintage Charger or Firebird at a car show could still stop people in their tracks. They represented a time when driving was a thrill, not a calculation. The 1970s taught a hard truth. The world couldn't chase horsepower forever. So the sound faded, replaced by the hum of compliance and the sigh of nostalgia. The engines grew quieter, the rules grew louder, and the roar of the open road became a memory. And as the engines quieted down, another kind of noise was about to disappear. Remember when car horns could sing? You'd tap the button and hear a jaunty La Cucaracha echo down the block, or maybe a wolf whistle, a trumpet fanfare, or even the opening bars of Dixie. It was the 1970s, and your car wasn't just transportation, it was your stage. Every beep and flash was an extension of personality. From musical horns to blinking lights, drivers found ways to make their rides talk, laugh, and sometimes even prank other motorists. But what felt like harmless fun soon got the attention of lawmakers. Musical and novelty horns might have made people smile, but they also caused confusion and chaos on the road. A car that suddenly blared a police siren could make other drivers panic. Some even installed real sirens, pretending to be law enforcement to clear traffic, a trend that quickly became dangerous. What started as a joke crossed into illegal territory, and soon, federal and state laws cracked down. Then came the flashing lights. In the 70s, it wasn't uncommon to see red or blue strobes mounted on personal vehicles, especially on muscle cars or off-road trucks. They looked cool, like something out of a chase scene in a movie. But when too many people started playing cop for style points, the government drew a hard line. Red and blue lighting became strictly reserved for emergency and police vehicles. The message was clear: no more confusion on the highway. Even outside of law enforcement, new lighting laws tightened the fun. Flashing front lights, neon strobes, and rear wigwag blinkers were phased out or restricted. Anything that could distract another driver or mimic official signals was banned. The highways became quieter, less colorful, and more uniform. Safety replaced spectacle. Still, it's hard not to smile at the memory. You'd pull up to a stoplight in 1976, and the car next to you might honk the Star Wars theme or flash rainbow lights across its grille. People laughed, waved, and shared a moment of light-hearted mischief. Today, that same display could earn you a hefty fine or even an arrest. The shift says a lot about how the culture changed. The 70s were about flair, expression over order, personality over protocol. Cars were rolling reflections of their owners, and the open road was a playground. But as technology advanced and roads became busier, safety and regulation began to win the battle against creativity. By the 1980s, musical horns had vanished, and flashing lights became the domain of tow trucks and ambulances. The fun got filtered out in the name of uniformity. The era of singing cars and blinking chrome faded into nostalgia, another reminder that freedom on the road always comes with limits. And if sound and light got tamed, one other outlaw feature was hiding in plain sight right behind your seat. It's hard to imagine now, but there was a time when the back seat felt like a playground. Kids would sprawl across the vinyl bench, trading snacks or pressing their faces to the glass as the world blurred by. Some even stretched out to nap, their heads bumping gently with every pothole. Seatbelts, if they existed, were often buried between the cushions or ignored completely. Parents didn't worry much. If you could see the kids in the rearview mirror, that was safe enough. In the 1970s, freedom was still the rule of the road. Families piled into station wagons with fold-down seats or rear-facing benches, perfect for waving at drivers behind them. Dogs perched proudly on the back ledge, their noses pressed to the sun-warmed glass. No booster seats, no buckles, just wind, laughter, and the sound of the AM radio humming beneath it all. But beneath that warmth was danger waiting to happen. Without restraints or structural protection, a simple fender bender could turn catastrophic. A sharp brake to throw a child forward. A rear-end collision could send them flying. The tragedies started to pile up, stories that made headlines and broke hearts. Doctors and safety experts began to sound the alarm. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration took notice. By the late 1970s, regulations started to tighten. Seatbelts became standard equipment, and automakers began reinforcing rear seats to better withstand impact. Child car seats, once considered overprotective, became essential. Public awareness campaigns filled TV screens with messages that felt shocking for their time. Buckle up or risk everything. Still, many resisted. For years, seatbelt laws were seen as an attack on personal freedom. People argued that the government had no right to tell them how to sit in their own cars. It took decades of education and countless preventable deaths before most of the country accepted that safety wasn't control. It was protection. Looking back, it's easy to feel both nostalgia and disbelief. The sight of kids lying on the back seat with a bag of chips, the family dog panting happily beside them, feels like a scene from a simpler world. But simplicity often came with a cost. The back seat wasn't built to save lives. It was built for comfort and convenience. And for too many families, one moment on the road changed everything. By the early 1980s, the carefree back seat had disappeared. Seatbelts, headrests, and safety latches became standard, and the days of rolling around unbuckled faded into memory. It was the end of a kind of innocence when the journey mattered more than the rules, and everyone believed that bad things only happened to someone else. But danger wasn't just inside the car. Sometimes it came from what hung outside it. In the 1970s, cruising without a front license plate wasn't just legal in many places. It was a statement. The front of your car was meant to be clean, unspoiled, and full of attitude. Whether it was the grin of a chrome bumper or the snarl of a muscle car's grill, that face said everything about the driver behind the wheel. For a while, you could roll down Main Street looking like you just drove off a movie set with no numbers, no tags, just style. For car enthusiasts, the front plate was an eyesore. It broke up the clean lines of the hood, ruined the symmetry of the design, and took away from what automakers worked so hard to perfect. The Dodge Challenger, Pontiac Firebird, and Chevy Camaro, these cars looked right without that rectangle of metal bolted to their noses. A bare front end was cool, rebellious, and unmistakably 1970s. But as the years rolled on, the rules caught up. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, most states began requiring both front and rear plates. The reason sounded practical enough: better identification, faster toll collection, and easier law enforcement. Traffic cameras, red light sensors, and speed traps needed that second plate to catch violators. What was once a symbol of personal freedom became a tool for public accountability and, some would say, surveillance. Technology helped seal the deal. As automatic plate readers became common, states realized that having two visible plates meant double the chances of tracking a vehicle accurately. Law enforcement and city planners saw efficiency. Drivers saw intrusion. That small, flat piece of aluminum suddenly felt like a tag on privacy itself. Still, not every state gave in. Even today, a handful of U.S. states, mostly in the South and parts of the West, still let you skip the front plate. It's a tiny rebellion that keeps a bit of that 1970s spirit alive. Drivers in those places often say it's about aesthetics, but deep down, it is about something more, an echo of a time when roads felt freer and rules felt looser. To some, the front plate debate might seem trivial, but for car lovers, it marks a cultural shift, from the romance of anonymity to the age of accountability. The 1970s car represented individuality, a nameplate on the back, a clean face up front, and a world where not every move was tracked or scanned. Today's cars, covered in sensors and data, feel more watched than ever. The front plate didn't just change the look of a car, it symbolized the tightening grip of order over expression. And then came one of the most controversial bans of all, the tinted rebellion. Deep tints that turned glass into mirrors, tail fins that sliced through sunlight like wings, engines that didn't purr, they roared unapologetically. The 1970s car was more than transportation. It was a moving piece of self-expression, part sculpture, part rebellion. It wasn't built to blend in, it was built to stand out. But over time, the sharp edges, the loud pipes, and the dark windows all met the same quiet fate: regulation. Tinted windows were among the first to fall. In the late 70s and early 80s, they were symbols of mystery and cool sleek, movie star glass that turned every driver into someone worth wondering about. But police officers saw a problem. Dark tinting made it impossible to see inside a vehicle, raising safety and enforcement concerns. Laws followed, setting limits on how much light a window had to let through. What once looked glamorous soon became a traffic stop waiting to happen. Then there were the tail fins, those sweeping, space-age designs that first peaked in the 1950s, but lingered in the 70s through custom mods and backyard builds. They were beautiful, excessive, and utterly impractical. As aerodynamics became science instead of style, fins disappeared in favor of smoother, wind-cutting shapes. The future demanded efficiency, not elegance. The chrome-heavy dream gave way to plastic bumpers and rounded corners. Noise came next. For years, the growl of a modified exhaust was a badge of pride, a statement that said, "This car has heart." But new noise ordinances and federal sound limits began muffling that spirit. By the late 70s, cities across America cracked down on loud mufflers and custom pipes. The days of a car shaking the neighborhood awake at midnight were over. One by one, the icons of freedom faded. The leaded fuel that made engines hum was banned. The gleaming hood ornaments that once caught sunlight were removed. The wild horns, the dangerous bench seats, the missing front plates are all pieces of a culture that loved risk as much as reward. The cars became safer, cleaner, quieter, but also, somehow, less alive. It's tempting to say we lost something when the rules came. Maybe we did. The thrill of the open road used to be a little dangerous, a little unpredictable. It belonged to the driver, not the system. But progress had its price, and the trade was made. Freedom for safety, individuality for order. Still, when you see a restored 70s muscle car rumble down the street, chrome flashing in the sun, you could almost Feel what it was like back then, the sound, the smell, the pulse of a world that was raw and real. Because every regulation came with a cost, and every car from the 70s reminds us what it felt like to drive free.